Okay, so this, I guess the best place to start is that we know you in the data center industry. You've been in there for a wee while, but it would be perhaps nice to have a refresher as to the various things you've done up to date in terms of the data center industry.
Well, Phil, I've been really lucky to have been in the industry since the sort of late 90s, really, and built facilities for public and private and on-premise. And during my time at KeySource, I was exposed to probably all elements and aspects of the data center industry, from finding sites, developing sites, optimizing sites, and designing and running facilities as well. So I feel like I've had a really good exposure to the industry as a whole, and I really enjoy this whole multidisciplinary approach. I enjoy trying to join all the dots in the different elements of the industry, and I've been very fortunate, and my time at KeySource was really enjoyable, and hope to continue in the industry for a while longer.
Yeah, so the reason we're talking today is you are the CEO, if I'm right, of Digital Infrastructure Advisors Ltd. So I'm, excuse my ignorance, but I'm not sure, is that a new venture and you're the new CEO, or has it been going for a while and you've joined it? What's the scenario? And obviously, can you give us a bit of background about the company itself?
Yeah, sure. So Digital Infrastructure Advisors, as you say, is a little bit of a mouthful. So we've abbreviated it to DIAL, which, there's some irony there, of course, but we're that a bit older. The DIAL business was set up to provide advisory services to investors and operators of data centers predominantly, and to probably take a slightly different view in terms of the services that we provide. And of course, we are able to provide design services and so on, but there's a big focus on due diligence and helping people to really understand the type of facilities that they've got, and how they're going to develop them, and ultimately how we're going to value them. I think there's been such we're all aware of the growth in the industry, but there's also been a huge amount of consolidation, and there's a lot of focus on new facilities, of course. But there's also, in any portfolio now, there's a real basket of different types of assets performing in different ways, built in completely different times. And so really helping people to understand what they've got and how we can transform those to meet the needs of the industry today is a big part of our work. And I feel that as we move forward and the industry changes a little bit, that the investors probably want to do one of two things. Either they're completely hands-off and that they buy into a business and let the management run it. On the other hand, they're building businesses from the ground up, and or want to take a much closer look at the asset they've got and how it's going to be developed. And perhaps how, if they own a portfolio of assets, even with different companies, how they're going to be able to create some continuity of service to their customers. I've seen some extraordinary situations where the most innocuous part of a data center, with a few racks being supported, can upset the relationship with a massive customer who's deployed thousands of racks, and actually the whole thing gets unpicked because of a few racks in an old facility. So, it's interesting work, and I like getting into the detail. So that's what we've been working at.
Yeah, so in sort of summarize, you're both helping existing facilities sort of improve, as you say, their efficiencies in various ways, but also, we're aware there's things like 5G edge, IoT, smart buildings, all that kind of stuff. And that's so with people looking at either upgrading those existing data centers or building in greenfield, brownfield, whatever, you've got those sort of twin approaches, existing and new. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely. And, my experience, I've built everything from a, public-private facility up to, scale campus type, facility. So I think that there is huge opportunity in edge, as we all do. And actually, we've been doing quite a lot of edge. And I think that what we'll definitely see moving forward is that as these applications and use cases develop more fully, then all of those elements will become much more relevant. And of course, edge means different things to different people. So we're definitely looking at and have deployed everything from a one independent, environmentally protected rack through to, perhaps 4 megawatt facility, which ultimately could become an edge for some of the larger players. So it covers the whole range of that. And I think there's a real convergence and interest around smart buildings and the infrastructure associated with that, because ultimately they're going to be edge deployments. And the whole land acquisition of land, identification of land in different geographies becoming hugely challenging, especially on the large scale, and that's well reported. But actually being able to deploy at the small scale at appropriate cost and appropriate time frame in the appropriate locations is equally challenging. So we're looking at it a bit more broadly in terms of not just the obvious redevelopment of logistics centres and so on, but which we are doing part of, particularly in Europe, but actually working with existing funds that have got portfolios of perhaps commercial buildings or other types of infrastructure, and exploring where we can develop edge facilities in existing buildings, as well as you say, deploying on brownfield sites.
And in terms of the sort of portfolio of services you offer, perhaps we can just touch on a few of those. So you've got something I think called business advisory service. That sounds quite a sort of catch-all type, but what does that mean in practice?
So I think in practice we look at the life cycle of a data center, and so that obviously starts with a strategy in the first instance. So the advisory services are really about helping to establish that strategy, validating that, and looking at whether we acquire land, whether we acquire businesses, and all the due diligence and process associated with site selection and so on. So that's very much the strategic part. And what I'm really interested in what we do is being able to understand the business driver between the business driver of the fund or the operator, so that we can bring together in a consistent manner all of the other services, which is the technical, the design, the operations, and so on, so that when we deliver all those services, which we can, right through to disposing of facilities, if you like, we're doing that very much from a business perspective, and we try to provide our clients with a consolidated approach and consolidated report that reflects all of these different elements in a consistent way.
Okay, and another one which in this day and age is sort of on the headlines every day is cybersecurity. So often, I mean, funny enough, although I suspect data centers are often involved, they don't seem to get the blame for it. It's the headline company has a breach somewhere in their system, but I guess data centers are fairly important, link in that cybersecurity chain. And it's you talk about data center operational technology. So can you talk us through a bit about sort of what that is and your cybersecurity sort of approach around that?
Well, for some humour, when you're at a dinner party and people ask you're in the data centre business, there's slightly more sort of social awareness of that, but it's pretty much a conversation stopper, even now. But when you talk about cybersecurity, this is something that's impacting all of us day to day. And you're right, it is something that can originate, a breach can originate in a data centre and often does. And I've always felt that as we have developed as an industry, particularly around what I call the infrastructure network, and we try to apply techniques which are more common in industrial environments and automated environments. One of the things that I feel that we haven't fully addressed is how we're going to secure those networks as they become more converged, as particularly it applies then to edge facilities, to smart buildings, as we deploy ever more IoT devices, so we increase the risk of breach exponentially. And my feeling has been that whilst we can all talk about cyber security at the dinner party, because it's affected all of us already and we're all very aware of it, I'm not sure that the industry understands just how vulnerable we are, and what the consequence of an attack on a data center might look like. And in many of the conversations that I've had with operators, they've talked more about the fact that they don't store so much private data, and so the regulations are less important to them. It's the responsibility of the tenants and the operators of the IT systems that really need to, to protect themselves in an adequate way. But then I looked at it in a different way to say, well, if we were able to take control of the data center remotely, and we were then able to apply ransomware to even restart the data center. When you look at this in the context of us trying to expand our capability and understanding of adjacent industries, industrial environment, for example, if a cyber criminal can hack a water supply, can hack a power station, then they can certainly hack a data center. And then the consequence of that is if the data center is shut down, for example, it not only impacts the data center operator themselves, but it also it impacts all of the people that are using the facility. And to put that in context, we had the Facebook offline for 6 or 7 hours. I'm not suggesting that was a cyber attack, by the way, but who knows? The consequence of that wasn't just the Facebook users, but it was the impact on the traffic, the impact on other applications. And we're talking about facilities that are part of the critical national infrastructure. And so I feel like there's a long way to go to ensure that we are really adequately protecting these businesses, and therefore the businesses that rely on them, from what I consider to be the preeminent threat to our industry, and actually many would say to society at large. So whilst I agree, and I'm sure we'll talk about sustainability, I feel like there's a real worry from my perspective that this whole notion that data centers are operating in this island mode, that they are so well secured, but actually I don't think that's the reality at all. And I think that a lot of people are kicking the can down the road, actually. And if you consider that essentially the business that we're in is based on trust. Our customers trust us that we're going to keep the lights on. And so if we're unable to do that, a failure in a system for a few minutes or it's catastrophic from a data center perspective. If we go down, uptime is compromised. We're all too aware of that. But when you look at the recovery times from a cyber attack, we're talking about weeks and months, and we're talking about such extraordinary exponential costs. So I feel like this is something that needs much more attention. I'm not alone and want to champion the cause because I think it's really important. Others like Ed Ansett has been talking about this for a long time, and others too. And some operators are taking really proactive steps. And I hope it's a topic that that we can all talk about, and perhaps collectively come together to really address this problem, because I think it's a problem for the industry. And if you look at some of the commentators in the World Economic Forum, for example, then you can see that what we're talking about is this is a public, governmental, a defence, a corporation level. This cooperation needs to be across the board, and that's something that I think we probably can do as an industry, and perhaps there'll be some forums that can focus and concentrate on this a little bit more than we have done, at least in my experience so far.
No, that's interesting, because I like yourself, visited 100 data centers, and the physical security, the barbed wire and the fences, everyone tells you just how difficult it is to pile into them. But as you say, in this day and age, the cyber security, the fences and all that are fairly irrelevant, aren't they? So, well,
there's an irony in that, because actually the deployment of IoT devices to, reinforce the physical security can in fact be quite a vulnerability from a cyber perspective. So, you see examples of specific cyber defense technology being deployed to protect things as innocuous as CCTV cameras in looking at a town centre, for example. So actually, the goes back to this smart buildings, this whole idea of the converged networks, that the more devices that we use that are smart, the more vulnerabilities potentially there are for cyber attack. So I think that that actually there needs a redoubling of understanding from both physical and digital security to ensure that all these things are aligned, and that we're not introducing vulnerabilities by trying to beef up our physical security.
Well, fair enough. One of the other areas which data center seems to, I don't know whether it's just it has a high profile for any particular reason, but legal services that everyone talks about, SLAs and all the paperwork that goes around, colos and that kind of stuff. You're offering help there, and I'm also, just what you've mentioned. Do you deal with the fallout as well from those sort of cybersecurity things? Is that an area you get involved with? What when you say legal services, what do you do and what don't you do, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
Well, I'm partnered with Ed Cook, right? So I'm sure lots of the viewers will know Ed.
Yes.
Ed's law practice is well regarded and has a unique understanding of this relationship between the law and technology and buildings. And in that, of course, cybersecurity then becomes a huge challenge. So working with Ed, what we're able to do is to audit facilities and processes, procedures against not only the standards that we need to comply to, but also best practice that needs to be adopted. And also create a playbook that deals with how we understand what the risks are, how we deal with them, and how we respond if we have been breached. There's no doubt that there are so many net new threats out there, never seen before events, and that's only going to continue to get more challenging to deal with. So what happens from a legal perspective, if you are breached, is really important. The cost of fines is going to change substantially in this space for sure, and the scope of the penalties is not just going to be restricted to data theft and so on. It's going to be how this impacts infrastructure overall. So having a legal position, both what you do, how you do it, what process you take, and the approach, is really important to protect yourselves. And furthermore, how do you deal with this from a reputational point of view? So I think the playbooks that we're developing for customers takes into account all of these elements in order to try and mitigate the impact as much as possible in the event, mitigate the event happening in the first place, and then if it does happen, to make sure we deal with it in the best possible way going forward.
Okay, and then if we move on to the sort of technical and design, again, I'm interested, where do you start and where do you start? Do you help people, you've alluded to the fact you help people identify potential sites. Can you then manage the whole construction process and then hand over the keys on day one? Where do you start? Where do you stop?
Well, I'm still very involved with the key source business, which that I owned and ran for many years. They have a fabulous design team there. Those guys can take us from concept through master planning and into detailed design. There's lots of big practices doing detailed design for sure. And working with Jim Hart and the guys from a construction management point of view, they're all part of our combined group as well, in the sense that we're working together. So yes, we're able to do a turnkey solution. I think the construction element in terms of a design and build, relatively unusual for us to do a full design and build, especially on scale. But certainly supporting that process, absolutely. From an international design perspective, as you know, I've worked in the States, I've worked in Asia as well, of course, here in Europe. I think the important part about design is making sure that this objective that we've got for what we want to achieve from a design point of view is delivered in different geographies. I think this is a challenge that everybody has. So being able to manage the design process in different geographies against a set of benchmarks or metrics that we want to achieve, but then localizing that, is the key challenge. So oftentimes the detailed design is managed by us, but by a third party in country, and that's the approach we take. I think that for the most part, from an operational perspective, people probably want to run their own facilities. There's no secret about the challenges from a resource perspective of doing that. But what we certainly have done is help to improve the operational performance of facilities once they're working, but also to stand up teams to make that transition between the closing construction phase and into operations, with teams that can bridge that gap whilst the full team can be brought on board. But I think going back to, we were talking earlier about how, what happens with Edge and how do I see this connection between, the design, the cybersecurity, and then the ongoing maintenance of these facilities. In many cases, they're not going to be manned. So the ability to be able to provide these services in an effective way across multiple geographies with many hundreds of sites, is equally challenging. And so we're developing tools and processes that enable us to do that. We're running a couple of hundred sites already from a mobile perspective. So I think that, that's an interesting development that pulls together this full life cycle that we talked about. You asked me about design, didn't you? Did I answer? Did I answer that part?
No, that's good. The other area which I know you've been involved in the past is on the sort of the actual sort of identifying sites, the investment, I guess, of financing of data centers. So I'm wondering, is Dial, is that something that, if somebody is looking to start a business, are you able to assist them with sort of locating finance and potential sites and all that? Or what work do you do around that?
Well, one thing I'm not is an accountant or a corporate finance advisor, but yes, absolutely. Helping to validate models, build models, to understand, the models, the way of charging and the way that the money is made is changing and is complex. So we can definitely absolutely bring the business edge to what this really looks like. Are what we're doing and modelling, is it realistic? And are the cost plans associated with that underpin this correct? And sure, we're working with customers that oftentimes, if they're an experienced fund or operator, they'll definitely have some models of their own. We can develop them from scratch if that's needed. But for the most part, I think it's about, are these real, and have we, is our due diligence really business focused in terms of validating what the hopeful outcomes are of these facilities, both new and existing?
So, I mean, in summary, if I've got this right, you're kind of managing the whole data center supply chain. So from that investment, the owners, operators, and all the way down to, do you get involved with the end users themselves, or do you stop at the sort of actual people who own the buildings, or some of the clients inside? Will you be able to help them as well?
Yeah, very much so. And in fact, what's interesting, and because I'm part of the Keysels Group now, that one of the things that we've always done at Keysels is looked at both elements. We all know we need to design the data center to accommodate the IT, and we've always tried to be, on the front foot of what the technology that needs to be supported looks like. And so the Keysels business is interesting in respect that we're dealing with end users as well, corporations, as well as operators. So I think we've got a good view of being able to help corporations, certainly stuff that we've done, where they're making this transition from on-premise to cloud. And of course, in reality, most people aren't making a wholesale change. They're going to a hybrid cloud environment. There's on-premise cloud solutions. And so, ultimately, I see this interconnected. There's lots and lots of activity around hyperscale, and we all know that. But there is also a huge amount of activity in supporting customers to make this transition to a hybrid cloud from a property perspective, from an infrastructure perspective as well. So we're definitely and absolutely helping customers make that transition and support this hybrid cloud environment. And a lot of that is being done with tier 2 cloud providers as well, as some of these niche markets, like high performance computing and the like.
Okay, and you mentioned earlier on in our chat the S word, which by the time this comes out, it will probably be over, but we're talking on day 3, is it, of COP, the COP event up in Glasgow. So I can't not ask you about sustainability. Clearly, we could have a completely different conversation, which would last ages, but just, I guess, some thoughts you have on, I mean, to me, the data center industry seems to be uniquely positioned in that it is, pointed out that it's one of the major consumers of energy. But on the plus side, one of the main reasons it's doing that is to support the digital activities of many organizations, as we were discussing before the interview. We're meeting on Zoom, which I'm pretty sure our carbon footprint's a lot lower than if we'd both driven or got on trains or whatever else to meet up in London, etc. So how does the industry, I suppose, manage that apparent contradiction?
I'm not sure it is a contradiction, actually, because I'm absolutely confident the data center industry is going to do everything, and has demonstrated, at least in the period that I've been involved, that we've reduced power. The technology industry are ever reducing the power consumption per compute. And notwithstanding the fact that the data center industry, as we see it, continues to be increasing and requiring more power, but we don't often talk about the net impact of some of the workload. So yes, we can look at social and we can look at commerce, like you've described, but a lot of the enablers to carbon reduction overall is the use of technology, how technology can model and inform the decisions that we make, track the progress that's being made. And so I think that you don't often hear about, we often hear about, we're taking 2 servers out of one, on-premise facility, and we're putting one into a co-location. It's all much more efficient, which is good. But actually, how about the net impact of the way in which technology is changing, not just our approach to sustainability, but it's broader than that, because it's the social impact that this technology is enabling. If you look at genomes and that kind of technology, that's hugely power consuming but hugely beneficial to society as well. So I do think there's 2 sides to that coin, and yes, we have an opportunity to make our part of it as efficient as possible and to continue to adapt the infrastructure that we provide to meet whatever the next generation of IT and storage technology looks like. That's our job, and to be creative around the ways that we can make use of renewable energy. There's some challenges around how we do that we're all aware of, but I think what's really interesting is how we're going to get by that and who's prepared to make the investments to bring true renewable energy power generation close to the point of use. That's, how do we get around this energy storage issue, and all of those challenges I think are really interesting. We can make, I believe in the near term, we can make some really interesting gains in that area. So I'm pretty confident that I think we're held to account pretty highly as an industry, and rightly so, of course. We're big consumers of power. But I'm confident that we'll do what we need to do to ensure that our industry is adopting the very best practice and taking a really pragmatic approach to this.
And do you think the industry, up to date, obviously it is more or less self-regulated, do you think that will carry on, or do you fear or think that at some stage government will start meddling or putting on specific legislation targets or whatever? Or do you think the industries can demonstrate what it's done today and say, leave us alone, you can trust us to head in the right direction?
I think Emma Fry is probably better placed to answer that than I was. There are many wiser and better informed people than me. I mean, what I can say is, for sure, we've always discussed about whether legislation would be a good thing or not. And I guess in my heart of hearts, I suppose it is inevitable. I just think because the use of technology has become such an important fabric in society that, you know, we already see a lot of moves towards trying to control that, you know, in Europe less so, and in other countries more so. So yes, of course, I think that the whole raft of legislation that's trying to control big tech across the world now is definitely going to have an impact on our industry, and probably is having a bigger impact than we would imagine already.
Okay, that's great. Well, it's been lovely to chat. So, Mike, thanks very much indeed for your time. Thank you.
Oh, thanks, Phil. Pleasure.